Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the second panel of day 2 of Urbana in 2024. I'm Aditi, and I'll be moderating and hosting today's discussion by a set of researchers who are here to talk about what marginality means to economic lives in India, both in how we conceptualize them, the concepts that allow us to describe them properly, and how we work towards moving towards those categories. So we have 6 speakers today who in some way touch upon the issue of work at the margins of legible economics, right? Legibility is just one aspect of economies that we hold in terms like informal, unorganized, non-standard. And the panel last evening had some really thought-provoking and thoughtful accounts of how poor these terms are, yet we continue to use them. And one of those, of course, has been informality, and we again use this and try and redescribe what this is in this panel. And the opportunity that brings us here together is to think about economic lives without these categories and what they mean to us. And all 6 speakers today come from fairly different disciplinary backgrounds, all asking questions about economic lives in our cities. 3 papers explore what innovation does to the contours of economic life. So innovation as technologies of corporations, governments, and people. So the presentations by Anurag and Shubhanshi, Dimri, and Priyanjali look at what platforms have done to the idea of change in the economic lives of workers. Anurag looks at a precursor to the platform or to the digital platform, which is how GPS trackers were installed in autorickshaws. Dimri and Sharma look specifically at domestic workers and how their lives change as labor platforms in the gig economy enter their particular labor market. Shekhar Jain brings us to the idea of jugaad, which is another word that's tried to find a respectful place in how we describe how people innovate material conditions. And he will talk to us about the operational elements of innovation for vehicles and what marginality means to creating innovation. Nidhi Wahi again explores domestic workers through their engagement with formal financial institutions. And Priyanjali Mitra looks at how women workers navigate and create resilience in labor markets wearing religious identities as Muslim women workers. And finally, we have Brishti Banerjee looking at the techniques of the state in categorizing marginal populations into categories like slums for understudied cities like Guwahati. And let me not take further time away from our speakers. I'll ask all of you to keep your presentations to about 10 minutes. And we'll take questions and answers at the end for everyone. And to start us off, can I ask Anurag to present?
Hi, everyone. The title of my paper is Prehistory of Platforms, wherein I look at the installation of GPS devices in auto rickshaw meters in Delhi. So in May 2008, Uber launched Movement, its proprietary anonymized platform to capture, interpret, represent, and understand traffic data and urban mobility platforms in Delhi. This initiative, it was understood, would provide government departments and urban think tanks better access to unavailable data, which could improve urban and transport planning. Industry experts, urban planners, and the state and federal government largely welcomed this initiative as a novel idea that complemented Prime Minister Modi's thrust on building 100 smart cities. The Urban Development Minister present at this launch even suggested that Movement's data would benefit 9 integrated command and control centers launched so far, which are state-of-the-art facilities that relay real-time data sets on a range of indicators, including transport and traffic systems. By launching Movement and sharing its data with the Delhi government, Uber appeared to have expanded its role from a transportation platform to a data-driven urban planning platform, prompting, if not catalyzing, the datafication of Indian roads. This anointment of data as capital has transformed many sectors of the economy by providing subsidized services and tapping into data markets. Uber Movement's tool was hailed as a novel initiative in that regard, one that generates new power relations and politics at various scales. I suggest that the datafication of Indian roads is an ongoing process since the 1990s, and movement is only a recent iteration of controlling and governing mobilities of machines and populations. I suggest that since the 1990s, Delhi has produced a techno-social regime that enrolls different groups of mobile bodies into digital technologies to not only solve mobility issues such as traffic, congestion, accidents, but to produce political outcomes concerning wider socio-economic problems. What I do in this presentation is I scrutinize one such site. I trace the trajectory of the GPS devices in auto rickshaws in Delhi. And I'm going to provide a brief history of the GPS meter project, which started from 2004 and I go on till 2009. I base my account primarily on publicly available copies of PILs on the Delhi GPS meter issue and on media coverage of GPS meters from 2004 to 2009 in three newspapers, Times of India, Hindustan Times, and The Hindu. It should be noted that by and large, this project was a bureaucratic failure because even as late as 2019, most auto rickshaws actually did not install these GPS-enabled meters. And transport authorities failed to collect the data generated from these meters as well. This was the central control room of the Delhi Integrated Multimodal Transit System, or DIMTS. However, despite the apparent failure of this project in fulfilling its stated objectives, I argue that it is misleading to analytically interpret the project as a failure. The immediate technical goals of the project were never realized, but it was gradually normalized into a socio-spatial order in which migrants, working class populations of Delhi were vilified. This process was institutionalized through a series of court decisions that served to strengthen a range of digital enclosures that constrained dangerous bodies, but also made them available for unfree, dependent, and disposable labor. To be sure, I am not arguing that location-aware technologies were incidental to the project, but location coordinates and the logic behind its definition were crucial, but the marginalization of working class populations in Delhi in alignment with broader economic objectives were not generated by the successful coverage or deployment of digital technologies. So the way it's structured is that I go on to the introduction and then I briefly recount a history of the GPS meter issue. And in the next section, what I'll do is I'll situate it in the platform studies, and finally, I will conclude why it's related to urban marginality. So in 2004, the idea of installing GPS devices was first conceived by the Transport Department of Delhi. At that time, they were looking at the Commonwealth Games, a showpiece games for an aspiring world-class city. After the GPS meter project languished in bureaucratic files for years, it received a fillip when in 2011, the Supreme Court instructed Delhi's Transport Department to work on a streamlined auto rickshaw policy. This policy, prompted by concerns of women's safety, efficiency, transport modernization, propelled the installation of a GPS-enabled meter on the auto rickshaw and urged auto rickshaw drivers to change from a single owner structure to a single owner structure from the three owner operator structure. Auto rickshaw driver unions protested the GPS meters, arguing that it would increase their operating costs. They were already struggling from previous policies. They had also objected the dependence of one vendor for the GPS meter. In these reports, at least a section of auto unions suggested that they were not against the GPS meters per se, but only against the non-negotiability of the deal itself, that they wanted to reserve the right to purchase GPS devices from preferred vendors. As early as 2012, media reports suggested that the new GPS meters fitted in auto rickshaws was rarely used and that overcharging of passengers continued as usual. All this changed with the gang rape and murder of 23-year-old paramedic student Jyoti Singh Pandey in December 2012. In the days that followed, mass protests, mostly led by young students, broke out. leading to far-reaching changes in legislation on women's issues. Among it was provoking large sections of Delhi citizens to demand tracking devices and constant monitoring of Delhi's public transport. In 2019, however, little had changed. Only about 31% of Delhi's 1 lakh odd auto rickshaws had GPS devices, and most of them were reported to be non-functional. The AAP-led state government in Delhi were considering waiving the vehicle fitness test charges and the annual charges for GPS meter tracking, which was around 1,200 rupees. It was widely understood as a move prompted by the impending elections in Delhi. Auto rickshaws were a prime voter bloc for the Aam Aadmi Party, but this policy alone was unlikely to encourage auto rickshaw drivers to install GPS meters. Can we move to the next slide? The next one. Yeah. And you can put the... So at a cursory level, what we can see is that this deployment seems to be an instance of a megacity of the global south, following in the footsteps of a global, largely Western-centric pattern of transforming coordinates of location into programmable data. Typically, large-scale datafication projects that engage in generation, extraction, and analysis serve higher corporate valuations of platform companies. These concerns may not be completely off the mark, as the stated objective of the installation of the GPS meter is to monitor the movement of auto rickshaws and taxis for the purpose of overall security and safety of the commuters, particularly of ladies, children, and the aged. And this is from the Delhi High Court's statement. What remains unexplained is the state's enthusiasm and endorsement of this project in the face of failure. Close to a decade after the initial proposal and rollout of these GPS devices, only 31% of Delhi's auto rickshaws had GPS devices as of mid-2019, and most of them were found to be non-functional. On top of that, the project to share and monitor the location data with the central control room seems to be a non-starter. In part, it can be argued that this is typical of bureaucratic and administrative inefficiencies in a city of the global south, but that is not all. That the state continues to pursue this project despite the failure to install GPS meters, monitor and govern auto rickshaw drivers through GPS meters, and a centralized control room suggests something else is at play. First, it sets into motion a culture of predictive profiling and social spatial sorting of undesired and unwanted bodies, but fashions older measures into subtler and non-invasive tactics. The fundamental principle behind this tracking and identification is nothing new. Specific populations have always been targeted, but in this case, the GPS meter cannot be employed to track and label precise movement. Rather, it adds a scientific basis to mainstream middle-class anxieties towards working-class men. Secondly, what I argue is that the policy pursuit of the GPS meter sets into motion a preferred policy regime for the technocratic management of social problems in the city. When technologies such as GPS meters become mainstream, it encourages a certain kind of technological solutionism, irrespective of the success or failure of the technology in achieving its desired objectives. And you can move to the conclusion slide. The next one, yeah. So what I do in this presentation is that I examine a rapidly unfolding data-driven techno-social regime in urban India by tracing the history of the GPS meter installation in auto rickshaws. I look at court documents and media reportage, and I suggest that this failure to install and enforce GPS-based location-aware technologies signals less the inability or inefficiency of the transport department and sheds light on the implications of this technology for working-class lives in Delhi. I argue that our understanding of the relentless pursuit to install GPS meters should be embedded in a longer history of the marginalization of the working class. The precise calculative imaginaries of location-aware technologies are not marginal, but the tracking of individuals does not seem to be its prime objective. Instead, it creates the conditions that subjects the working class to a systematic, perhaps less invasive, sorting and codification, and spawns a technocratic policy regime. Unlike Western cities, location-aware technologies may not have over-coded the spaces and practices of everyday life yet, But the experience of these GPS devices suggests that the gradual evolution of older digital urban configurations have furtively set the terms for the inherent scalable digital sociability of present-day platform capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Anurag. Can I have Shubhanshi and Pranjali please speak?
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Pranjali, and here is Shubhanshi, and we are working as research assistants at the Department of Women and Gender Studies from Savitribai, Phule, Pune University. And the title of our presentation, as you can see, is Shifts in Work Relations, a study on how gig economy is shaping work relations of domestic workers in Pune. So today we'll be discussing and presenting our observations from the research project conducted by the Department of Women and Gender Studies with Pune Zilla Kamgar Sangathan, and the project is titled Understanding the Changing Dynamics of Paid Domestic Services during the COVID-19 pandemic in the Pune metropolitan region. And this is an ongoing project where 3,000 domestic workers have been interviewed till now in metropolitan areas of Pune city, an area that has been severely affected by COVID both in the first and the second waves. The project is being focused on live-out domestic workers since they make up the majority of the domestic workers in the project area, and that can be readily accessed. The project also focuses on understanding the circumstances of the domestic workers pre, during, and post-pandemic to further endeavor towards a holistic policy for domestic workers that will take into consideration their needs, living conditions, and peculiar vulnerabilities. This ongoing research project and the union together demanded a thorough inquiry into how the advent of technology and the gig economy in the post-pandemic world is interacting with domestic work and how it has caused a shift and transformation in domestic work, which is in the lives of people who've been pushed to urban marginalities, thus with reference to the theme of the conference as well. So my colleague and I are a part of the extended research where we are exploring the shifts in work relations of domestic workers due to the influence of the quote-unquote gig economy. And as we all know, gig economy as a term is used to refer to labor markets identified by independent contracting through digital platforms. The effects of the gig economy can then be formulated as an economy redefining work and labor, which leads to severe commodification of work. And in the last few years, there have been many mobile applications, websites, and WhatsApp groups that have started to play the role of a mediator between domestic workers and their employers. And the gig economy attempts to formalize that informal sector on the sites of digital platforms by providing value-added services like background checks of the workers, payroll management, training, and so on and so forth. Gig work disrupts the idea of long-term contractual work to short-term, less intimate work. And there have been a fair number of studies on gig economy, certainly, and how it's affecting workers' lives and livelihoods. But among these studies, there's still a scarcity of research understanding domestic and gig work altogether. So we understand domestic work beyond the domestic household chores, which also include the reproductive activities performed inside the intimate spaces of the home. We live in societies which are governed by patriarchal and capitalist frameworks, their intricacies making it difficult for the economic market and Indian households to recognize the effort, labor, and work that goes into domestic work. And within the capitalist framework, where production is necessarily for profit, that is the market framework, and everything is monetized for it to be recognized as work. Domestic work is pushed out of the economic market, and hence it's not monetized, leading to its devaluation. And within the patriarchal setup, women have been socially and culturally attaining a secondary position, and therefore what work women do also falls into secondary stature, which obtains a sense of stigma, as it's also seen as dirty work. And as a result of the patriarchal and capitalist structures and societies, women themselves internalize devaluation and invisibilize their work. The complication of recognition arises due to the gendered nature of domestic household work and its visible transportation, which can be detected in the workers. And on one hand, gig work provides flexible working hours, freelance work, and benefits. But parallelly, we have to see gig workers mostly face the dark side of the gig economy with lesser job securities, low pay gigs, and less bargaining power, which might be due to the diminishing scope of unionization of gig workers. So, other scholars have also been reiterating that not enough attention has been paid to the hurdles and struggles faced by women pursuing gig work. And entry of the gig economy into the arena of domestic work has disrupted the idea of traditional domestic work, breaking that domestic work into professionalized tasks and gigs. And the process of intermediation also has shifted from traditional physical agencies to digital platforms that operate digitally and perform matchmaking based on algorithms. So the gig economy has invisibilized women's domestic work and pushed the workers out of employment protection and with little or no collective bargaining. So we are focusing on examining the structural changes in the work relations of domestic workers and employers regarding the gig economy in India to study how these work relations of women domestic workers are affected by the influence of the gig economy that disrupts the idea of a long-term work relations and provides short-term gig, thus forming a broader research question. So for the same, we are using the feminist research methodology in the way by trying to address this question by seeing through a socio-economic and cultural lens, by doing a thematic analysis of one of the interviews which we took. And now I'll hand over to my colleague who will talk about the findings and the remarks we've seen.
So, in connection with the literature read and understood, we browsed a few apps and agencies. We chose 4 to 5 digital platform agencies that have substituted domestic workers. While observing the platforms, we posed few questions about the target audience of platforms, kinds of services they are providing, information regarding the recruitment process, and social and local positions of domestic workers hired and their approximate remuneration attained. The online platforms are providing gigs or tasks like cleaning, cooking, elderly care, gardening, babysitting, pet care, washing utensils and clothes, etc. The tasks are charged differently or with the combination of extra work which are chargeable too. This might hint at how gig economy with a capitalistic framework divides conventional domestic work into tasks that are priced differently for profits. We also tried observing the hiring process through apps and websites and found the platforms are asking for names, email, mobile numbers, etc. A few platforms have online forms that the employer, which is the client, and the worker have to fill out. The data available on digital platforms were unable to answer questions like how many domestic workers get a call back after filling the forms, who are these workers who can access the digital spaces and connect with the agency. Further, we probe about the salary of the domestic workers, whether it is monthly based or per service based, who decide the price for those services, etc. We also looked for the benefits that the formalized gig economy might be providing, like health insurance for the domestic workers, vocal training courses, education benefits, etc. There are few platforms providing few benefits, and then the question we asked was who is paying for those benefits. But the important questions we further posed were about the rights of the domestic workers. Are their rights taken into consideration? I mean, are the platforms taking conscious measures for harassment and assault complaints? Is there a committee to help domestic workers in incidents of rape, sexual assaults, and harassments? Till now, we have taken an interview with the founder of one digital platform agency, which is active in Pune and provides labor in the main city as well as in the extended version of the city. We are trying to connect with other digital agencies. We contacted people who might have hired domestic workers through agencies or their websites. We are waiting for those responses. We contacted Pune Zilla Ghar Kamgar Sangatna, which is a registered trade union of domestic workers affiliated with the central trade union to get us contact with the gig domestic workers. Through our interview with the digital platform, we were able to understand their perspective on gig economy platforms and how they understand domestic work and workers. After our observation from the chosen digital agencies, we commenced approaching a few of them. We came across the paradox that their services are visible and available, but the domestic workers, gig domestic workers, are not. When we started contacting the platforms, we found that some didn't have offices, few didn't pick our calls, others were not interested in having a conversation with us. We were under the assumption that we would be able to connect the gig domestic workers, clients, and platform easily, as their services are available and visible through the social media, through memes, comedy videos, vlogs, etc., which made us bend towards our assumption. Presence of gig domestic workers, next slide. Presence of the gig domestic workers through social media was not enough for us to connect with them in reality. We interact with the gig workers in our everyday through platforms like Uber, Zomato, Dunzo, etc. But do we encounter with gig domestic workers on a daily basis? Do we know or understand their living, working condition and their peculiar vulnerabilities? Even after platforms claiming to be omnipresent and providing quote-unquote professional and skilled workers, it seems that they are not in our routine yet. The scarcity of experiences of gig domestic workers might hint that even gig economies market their workers as professional and lifesavers for our everyday. They're still not in our routine as traditional domestic workers are, as they're replaceable and work short gigs or tasks in different houses. With that, the space for them to connect also shrinks. The gig domestic workers are everywhere, and they might be portrayed as necessity in every day, but they are not routinized yet. This can be because of the nature of domestic work and gig economy that is creating a resistance to build a trustworthy relationship inside the intimate space of home. So we as researchers look at the fact that we could only get one interview from the platform as an interesting site where we can expand our understanding of mechanization of gig economy and how it is different in Indian context. Our secondary data highlights the characteristics of gig economy being formalizing and the informal sector, so to say, through providing customers with value-added services. The gig economy has been imagining formalization through the perspective of platforms and clients. In contrast to this, the understanding of domestic workers' unions for formalization is in the context with holistic policy, better pay scale, good working condition, unionization of workers, and collective bargaining powers. So in this, the dominant perspective of formalization does not include the characteristics that work towards the upliftment of the condition of domestic workers. It will also be interesting to see how gig economy is influencing the organization of domestic workers in Pune, because as Pune has a history of unionization of domestic workers and is one of the first cities to have domestic workers organizing domestic workers and talking about holistic policy. This is a working paper and a developing project that will incorporate further developments, and as we take interviews with more platform clients and domestic workers and investigate how they understand their experiences of the gig economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to ask maybe Priyanjali to go next. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you to change slide. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute honor to present at the Urbana this year. I am a doctoral student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. And today I'll be presenting data from ongoing ethnographic research, so any feedback obviously is welcome. So the paper that I'm presenting today is titled Navigating Margins, Religious, Gendered, and Class-Based Resistance Strategies Among Muslim Women in the Informal Labor Market. This paper will approach the conference's overarching theme of marginality, particularly from the perspective of informal workers in the urban economy. I will use cases of women in paid domestic work from research in Gurugram or Gurgaon. I'm going to refer to it as Gurgaon for the rest of the paper. And these cases essentially will highlight the nature of marginality as I have seen it, and the adaptations and strategies employed by workers who seek to re-articulate this form of marginality in their everyday life. So at the outset, it must be stated that India's domestic workers face caste, religion-based discrimination and violence, as many of us know. But Muslims are further marginalized. Estimates suggest that 9 out of 10 Muslim workers in India earn their livelihood in the informal economy. A 2020 study by iWage, or the Initiative for What Works to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy, and ISST, found out that more Muslim women are engaged in the informal sector than women from any other religion in India. These women demonstrate different ways of resisting marginality that they face. They frame their struggles through the outsider lens, something that I will come back to. And they refer to their migrant status in the city constantly and how they are perceived as a consequence. So it is this status that dictates the form and content of any form of resistance that I will discuss today, in the workplace and beyond. And in this context, both the workplace and spaces beyond the workplace are equally important and interconnected, as you will see. So very briefly, conceptually, I will draw from Cindy Katz's 2004 conceptualization of agency as resistance, resilience, and reworking. You will find the presence of these 3 different kinds of ways of navigating marginality in the cases I discuss. Next slide. Oh, that was the next slide. Okay, I think we've gone far ahead. Can we go back? Thank you so much. I began the fieldwork for this project in the summer of 2021 in 2 urban villages in Gurgaon. Urban villages in Indian cities are urbanized villages. Again, I'm assuming many of us know this. That is, originally villages that have conformed themselves to the urbanization around them. There are existing pockets of old villages that have gotten almost cramped among the rapidly rising city around them. Gurgaon has many, many such urban villages, as does Delhi and other cities. Urban villages are often inhabited by recent migrants to the city who perform all kinds of informal work and also perform informal work in the formal sector. And they have dormitory-style living for relatively cheaper rates compared to their surrounding neighborhoods. Domestic workers in the urban village where I began this ethnography were my inroads into the community. They migrate from different states to work in this city, but particularly in my case, it's West Bengal, and that has a specific role to play in the cases I discuss. Next slide. So without romanticizing notions of resistance among this group of workers, which I want to underscore, I seek to reveal the entanglements of religion and gender in these narratives. Through the cases I will discuss, I contend that the notion of marginality and resistance is socially constructed, is subjective, it emerges in a non-linear fashion, and the ways of exercising agency are multifaceted, and often a product of inter-worker interactions that are beyond the workplace. To understand marginality and the ways of existing in and adapting to it, I argue it is also crucial, like I said, to go into the neighborhood, to go into the community, and of course to go into the body or the household. It is crucial to extend our examination to the bodies, but also what happens between the madam's or the employer's house where they work and their own homes where they continue laboring, as the previous presentation mentioned. Next slide. So one of the things I repeatedly have been hearing in the fieldwork when asking workers to describe their relationship with the city and its people is, and I'll quickly say it in Bengali first, আমাদের বাইরের বাঙালি বলে ওরা, মানে আমরা এখানে মুসলমান ছোট ঘরের কর্মী. For the benefit of everyone in the room, this roughly translates to, we are considered Bengali outsiders in the city, workers from lower class Muslim households. This really captures the myriad forms of marginality and othering, and the multi-layered ways in which marginality exists in their lives, right? There's the economic, the social, the religious, and the ethnic. And very importantly, workers demonstrate an acute awareness of this form of marginality. It's not that they're passive or are completely ignorant of what they face in their everyday lives. Next slide. The first interlocutor I will introduce you to is called Rabia Khatun. For Rabia Khatun, she's my primary interlocutor in the field. She's 35 years old. She considers herself a veteran domestic worker. Doing work is an act of empowerment, as she keeps mentioning. She considers herself a veteran because she's been doing this as long as she can remember, since she was 13. She migrated to Gurgaon from Malda with her parents and her 4 siblings. She knows more about this form of work, she says, than most of her peers. Doing this work well and managing the home front as well is her way of exerting a breadwinner status in the household. Now, she's a part-time domestic worker, and she works for about 12 hours in the day with a 2-hour lunch break. Like many others, she'll come back home for lunch and a nap in the afternoons before heading back for a second shift. In her own household, and she says this very categorically, she considers herself the stable income earning member of the family, particularly post-COVID, with a husband who works in the unpredictable construction sector. So she says, relatively speaking, Didi, if you compare the two of us, Rahim and me, I bring in the bulk of the money in the household. I pay rent, I pay for children's education, I pay for our living expenses. His work is totally unreliable. And she often mentions this in front of him, which has its own very interesting implications in terms of their dynamics. At times, he might get work for 20 days a month, but during a lean period, it might be even as less as 10 days. Post-COVID, it went down to 3 days a month, which means I need to run the household. His money is used for miscellaneous expenses. It allows me to decide where to put my children for schooling, for instance, but I often tell him I'll probably continue to be the stable one, he the precarious one. In a broader context with so much precarity and informality in their lives, it's a very interesting way of dealing with their everyday marginality. Here, Rabia contests the patriarchal notion of the male breadwinner, right? She combines her strong belief in her skills and reputation that she's gained, the stable income that she says she brings in, and her ability to, as a result, take decisions for the household. She keeps telling me about the children who are in private school in the village and her daughter who's in the madrasa in Malda. And she says that it took a lot and a lot of resistance, as one can understand, from the extended family and the husband. But at some point, she had to take those calls. I argue that her own material stability in a very precarious line of work with a deep sense of economic marginality has enabled her to sustain her household. Further, younger domestic workers often call upon Rabia when I'm interacting with her for advice regarding job opportunities, difficult employers, managing care work and domestic work. And she keeps saying, if we are to build community in the shahar or the city, it is very crucial for us to share information with one another, particularly with the younger ones who are just entering the domestic work market. Next slide. Interestingly, in a highly competitive paid domestic work market, where a good worker, who is a good worker and what that really means is a very contested notion. It's often a topic of discussion among workers. Rabia says the Muslim Bengali women are the hardest workers despite facing a sense of persecution daily. She compares them to the women from UP who accompany their husbands to the city in search of work. So in the vignette here, she says, you should see them. They spend all their time confined to the house, not earning any money, living off their husbands. Look, we are all unstable. But what makes us better is that we don't hide behind our hijab or our ghungat and sit at home. We cook, we clean, we cook and clean our madam's houses too. Everyone is poor, you have to work to do better. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip to the next slide. So one of the other cases that I introduced here is that of Rubina Begum. In the aftermath of the beef ban in Gurugram, she took it upon herself to organize the men and women in her neighborhood to continue to clandestinely buy and consume meat, often to the detriment of their safety. So the Makan Maliks and the landlords and their staff often control the consumption of food in the tenements, but small groups of workers in different urban villages in Gurgaon have found ways to circumvent this constant surveillance, implementing this 2015 beef ban that the Haryana government put in place. Landlords, to be sure, have their henchmen. They are aided by Hindu vigilante groups, of course. But this doesn't take away from the fact that there have been these acts of resisting. these very kind of active ways of policing them. So Rubina tells me, and very interestingly, while she was cooking beef one evening, that, as you know, beef has been banned in the state of Haryana. Earlier, there used to be shops right next to our house. Now, we just collect the money. One of us goes to the UP-Delhi border, buys it, and then he comes back and distributes it clandestinely. So there is, again, here this really interesting, unequal, lopsided power relationship between the landlords and rentiers. But I would come back to the fact that there are forms of subversion, and there are ways in which they contest these forms of, in this case, religious marginality that they face, right? I had another case, but then again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to conclude here by saying that through these different cases, and the various complications that come with being informal workers in the new liberal city, it is these everyday acts that actually subvert power relations a little bit, instead of completely dismantling all of these entrenched hierarchies. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that. Shekhar Jain, who's joining us online, can I ask you to turn your video on and share your presentation with us?
Hi, thanks a lot. I hope my presentation is visible.
We can see you.
Just a second. Yep. Now it will be.
Yes, there we go.
And I hope I'm clearly audible.
Absolutely, we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you, Team ARC, for selecting my presentation. It's an honor to present at Urban ARC. In my presentation is titled as Contour of Marginalities and Informal Sector Innovation, Comparative Case Study of 3 Indian Informal Vehicle, also known as jugaad vehicle. In my presentation, I will discuss the informal sector innovation using the case of jugaad vehicle. I'll begin my presentation by contextualizing informal sector innovation within marginality discourse, followed by a discussion on jugaad and informal transportation. Thereafter, I will discuss the 3 cases of jugaad vehicle and will conclude my presentation after that. The presentation is part of my PhD work, where I have used these 3 cases to understand the standard and standardization aspect of informal sector innovation, dwelling into an uncharted territory of the informal standards. One of the novelty aspects of this thesis is in the reorganization of the literature on formal standard to make it applicable to understand standard and standardization in the informal sector. Marginality and informal sector innovation. Historically, the idea of marginality emerged as a notion of subjugation and stigmatization. At present, we also see it as a function of inequality due to social condition in terms of hierarchy and barriers. The marginality can emerge due to spatial, infrastructural, socioeconomic, and regulatory reasons, which is often manifested in the form of disadvantage and exclusion. The sites of marginalities are considered as important sites of creativity and production, though mainstream innovation discourse ignored these aspects. At present, the creative endeavor of people at margin is often discussed within the umbrella theme of informal sector innovation, which shares space with many related themes, such as frugal innovation, grassroots innovation, and jugaad innovation. Informal sector innovation are deeply intertwined with the marginalities. This theme of innovation research goes beyond mainstream Schumpeterian framework of innovation, wherein organizational routine are central to the innovation process and firms are treated as basic unit of innovation. The informal sector innovation is considered to be carried out by the people or individuals at the margin. This brings the knowledge and innovativeness of these people at the margin within the fold of innovation discourse, who otherwise are stigmatized and considered marginal minds, or underestimated of their potential to generate knowledge. Jugaad is an Indian term, and for us, it is an approach to do things and relates to the alertness of mind, knowledge about existing possibilities available in the immediate environment, and a dedication to solve every problem one confronts in his business or surroundings. In a very simplistic sense, it can be related to the ability to devise impromptu solution when the protocolized methods fail to deliver or are inaccessible for the immediate needs. These jugaad innovations also close the design reality gaps, or one can say they grow in the gaps which are left out by the protocolized solutions. The pictures on your screen is first image is from the jugaad. First image on the left is from NCRT textbook for 3rd class, where they have used the word jugaad to describe a vehicle played in Gujarat. Second image is an event by a national daily wherein they want to describe Indians using the words they use, and jugaad is one of them. And third image on the right, you can see is Nitin Kamath, founder of Zerodha, who says jugaad is what unite Indians. So this clearly explains that how much relevant jugaad is for us Indians. Informal transportation literature characterizes informal vehicle as locally adapted and modified vehicles which emerge as a response to local needs, conditions, and cultures. These vehicles are manufactured informally or in small firms using the indigenous local technology and resources. Such vehicles carry a distinct advantage of being low cost, user-friendly, customizable, and have simple technology, which makes it easier for their operator to maintain and operate them without much technical skills. Success of such vehicle depends upon their context sensitivity and socio-culturally appropriateness, along with presence of infrastructure facilities like availability of spare parts, their retailers, and skilled mechanics. A socio-economic implication like employment generation, cheaper transportation for the poor, and potential to meet the unfulfilled transportation requirement often make them a favorite of people at the margin. Jugaad vehicle in Indian context share the characteristics of informal transportations. These vehicles are locally made vehicles manufactured primarily by the local mechanics using the available resources, not necessarily of the motor vehicle. These jugaads are not conventional vehicle and designed to fulfill the local need as per the context. The needs may not always be the mobility. They may also evolve as a response to the regulatory exclusion or the design gaps in the formal vehicle. As these vehicles use the bare minimum material, so they may not always look as finished as factory-made vehicles, which at times attract skepticism. In our view, these vehicles helps in democratization of vehicular technology, which empowers its user to define the vehicles as per their needs, in addition to providing extra freedom in maintenance and operations. So I'm just trying to show the landscape of the jugaad vehicle across the world. So this image you can see. The vehicles similar to jugaad vehicle also can be seen in countries like Philippines, Pakistan, Cambodia, Indonesia, Ivory Coast, Gaza. There are many more. I haven't put in the pictures, but they are mostly available in the developing part of the world. These are the pictures of jugaad vehicles from India. Top left corner is the Fatfat Seva. And if you notice on the top right corner, that is Vanu from Bengal. One can clearly see that how the engine is placed inside the vehicle. And that engine is not a vehicle engine, it's a generator. And these engines are not always the engine mean for water vehicle. They could be diesel engine mean for water pumps or electric generator, as we can see. Fatfatiyas, that is on the top left, are the oldest of these vehicles, which are repurposed Harley-Davidson bike left by the Britishers. Similarly, repurposing of Harley-Davidson bike was done for bike left by Americans in Vietnam. This makes jugaad vehicle a historical artifact, not just a contemporary subject of mobility. These are few more examples of jugaad vehicle from different areas of this country. These are the three cases I'm going to discuss. I'm using to discuss my case. The three cases. First is the jugaad rehri or motorcycle rickshaw, that is A and B. These are made out of scrapped scooter engine or motorcycles. Second is e-rickshaw that emerged within the contours of informal economy in Delhi around 2011 and was later regularized once it gained the privileged threshold. The third, that is D and E, which are battery jugaad. We have named them as battery jugaad. They are jugaad vehicle which emerged in Old Delhi as e-rickshaw regulation discouraged the rickshaw aggregator who give rickshaw on rent. So, in concluding remark, we found that jugaad vehicles aren't downgraded version of the protocolized vehicle. They are in actually an upgrade of the cycle rickshaw community, cycle rickshaws, a niche which sustains because of several spatial, infrastructural, socioeconomic, and regulatory marginality. The narrow street width, which is prevalent within Indian cities, makes formal motorized vehicle unviable in such settings. This creates a niche which is served only by manual cycle rickshaw or rehris. On the other hand, e-rickshaw grew as there was an unmet need of last mile paratransit vehicle. Also, the stringent regulation on modification or customization of formal vehicle make it difficult for the customization of formal vehicle. Additionally, many other transportation rules like for carrying protruding material discourage the use of formal motorized vehicle to carry small loads. In these cases, jugaad vehicle helps. The jugaad vehicle in most cases are promoted by cycle rickshaw drivers or members of the labor peasant community who invest in these machines to better their own life despite the informality and illegality of these vehicles, while the general population legitimize these vehicles for their human outlook. For political actors, these vehicles make a political relevant group as their number and economy they govern is large enough to impact politics, which somewhere draw political patronage. The adoption of these vehicles also addresses different form of regulatory exclusions, like earlier to obtain commercial driving license required experience and minimal education qualification. In fact, during the regularization of e-rickshaw, these criteria had to be relaxed. On the other hand, the e-rickshaw regulation deliberately discouraged the aggregators, so to protect their business interests, they came up with a new kind of battery vehicle, that is what we are calling battery jugaad. These vehicles were more suitable in the tiny streets of Old Delhi and quickly gained the market and even diffused to newer area like Ghaziabad, which is adjacent to Delhi. Besides, the informal nature of jugaad vehicle helps them avoid the stringent motor vehicle regulation. Here, e-rickshaw regulation teaches us that regulatory space for innovation emerging in the margin should be considerate about the aspects of the margin, otherwise it may alienate the marginal actors. The jugaad vehicle survives due to toleration or ignorance of the state actors, or with their active coalescence, or because of the regulatory confusion. The state coalescence is seen in the context of battery jugaad, wherein there are organized informal syndicates which ensure survival of these vehicles in lieu of monthly payments. While in Ghaziabad, battery jugaad has been able to take trade licenses from Ghaziabad municipality in the pretext of these vehicles being battery rickshaws. This is a case of regulatory confusion, as these licenses must be given only to the formal vehicles. All in all, the jugaad vehicles are the result of different marginalities which haven't attracted much scholarly attention in the Indian context, despite being ubiquitous and present all over the country. It is often invented by the people at the margin to fulfill the gaps created by the formal vehicles. Most often, these vehicles are misunderstood as downgraded or jury-rigged version of the formal vehicle. However, they are in reality an upgrade of the manual-driven vehicles and are often robust enough to cater to the need. In fact, we found that during COVID, many people use these vehicles to go back to their home, which was 1,000 kilometers away from Noida. That is from Noida to Bihar, Noida to MP, they went. This way, this research highlights that there is need to study such informal sector innovation in great detail. Perhaps the marginality perspective is helpful as it highlights a condition which leads to the design reality gaps and motivate people to do jugaad. This in turn will help in making inclusive policies and products reducing the marginalities. Thank you. I hope I'm in time.
Thank you so much, Shekhar. Yeah, absolutely. We got all of that. Thank you.
And just
we had
stop sharing.
a participant, Nidhi, who hasn't joined us. So maybe I can ask Brishti Banerjee from the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, to start presenting.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brishti. I'm a PhD student at the Interdisciplinary Center for Urban Science and Engineering at IIT Bombay. The title of my paper is Unstable and Uncertain Informal Settlements and the Politics of Policy Categories in Guwahati City. This is a working paper and it's still evolving from my field work. And the presentation outline is something like this. I begin with the context, setting the context, and then focus on politics of policy category, which basically animates the paper, and then touch upon the lived implications of these policy categories for people living in informal settlements. And finally, I end with concluding remarks. So to set the context, globally and in India, government and institutions have adopted different policies for informal settlements or slums, especially in the housing context. To a large extent, policies and their designs depend on how the state sees, defines, and categorizes these spaces. Slums are not homogeneous and variability exists among slums within and across different cities. Such variabilities are also constructed by the state, as we will see. Certain countries categorize slums to distinguish those with greater deprivation in terms of urban living standards. For example, legal and illegal kampungs in Jakarta, Indonesia. In case of India, also different official agencies define and categorize slums like the census 2011 categorizes slums as identified, notified, and recognized. And the National Sample Survey Organization categorizes them as notified and non-notified. Now, notification is a key determinant as it provides legal recognition to slums. However, the criteria for notifying slums tend to vary across states within India, and it may not always be respected by the state, so it differs. So why do we need to investigate or critique slum categories? Now, Britain observes that categories are intrinsic to the language of policy and are crucial for design and implementation of policies. Scholars like Bhire and Bhan notes that categories tend to naturalize socio-spatial hierarchy and may not reflect concrete realities. This calls for a need to critically reflect on working of these categories and question their internal logic and discursive and political effect of their circulation. In this working paper, I developed the case of Guwahati city in Assam, and the motivation behind this has been to move beyond dominant geography of theory and explore under-researched urban geographies. Guwahati is the largest urban agglomeration in the northeast region of India, and with the highest slum population. Guwahati is also characterized by its unique geopolitics and social realities like ethnic conflict and the insider-outsider politics rooted in the region's history. So the paper explores two main questions. One is, how does the state construct policy categories for slums, and what are the lived implications of state-constructed policy categories for people living in informal settlements? So methodologically, I employ constructionist and critical ethnography of policies, and I ground my analysis based on several data sources, including field notes. I utilize multiple methods like engage observation, semi-structured in-depth interview, some longitudinal interviews, informal conversation, focus group discussion with various stakeholders over 10 months of fieldwork spanning from August 2020 to November 2023. I also analyze policy documents, slum list, and other archival data available at the some state archives. Now, informal settlements existed in Guwahati before independence, but witnessed a significant growth with the shifting of the capital from Shillong to Dishpur, Guwahati in 1972. Mahadeviya et al. Notes that most of these settlements came up through dakhal, which is a local term for informal occupation of land, due to the shortage of land supply and increased land value in the city. Among these, some informal settlements characterized by high population density, predominantly inhabited by low-income people, are categorized as slums. I note that unlike Indian cities like Mumbai, Calcutta, and Delhi, the word slum in Guwahati has a post-colonial genesis. As per the archival records, the word slum finds first mention in 1957, particularly the state's impulse. And I note that to define and label specific informal settlements as slums emerged from the need to implement national urban renewal schemes. Over the years, various agencies have defined and categorized slums differently, leading to conflicting data on slums in the city. So here is a table that I've prepared, where we see that over the years, different agencies, government agencies, have categorized and defined slum in different ways. And we are going to look at the last two, which is now reflected in most of the policy documents in the city. That is the Rajiv Awas Yojana survey, which was initially conducted by the Guwahati Municipal Corporation. And Rajiv Awas Yojana team has considered this 2012 survey as a baseline. And the currently in operation, this PMAY, which is Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana urban survey, which again takes the GMC 2012 survey as the baseline. So we will be comparing these array and PMAY survey. I'll be referring to them as so. So we see that I note and I argue that the policy categories for slums in the city lack conceptual clarity and exhibit inherent ambiguity. And during my interaction with some state officials and GMC official, it is noted that they absolutely have no clarity or no idea on what is what is the criteria for notifying, or are the slum lists notified or not. So here is an interaction with the state government official who remarks that we have a slum list, but our office is not sure whether GMC, that is the Municipal Corporation of Guwahati, recognizes the list or not. So this list is notified of non-notified slum may not be correct. So there are these contradictions that are visible in interactions with different government officials. And I also observed that, there are, when you look at these two lists, there are mismatch of the names of the slums. And as I personally visited, many of these settlements that are listed, I found that there were instances where some slums listed under the PMAY list were not present under the RAY list and vice versa. So when I discussed my observation, and inquired about these discrepancies with policy actors in different government departments, the response was inadequate. So also, very interestingly, Guwahati has a very distinct geography in the sense that, there are, and the state is completely ignorant about these specificities, that when it comes to informal settlements, they are present across hills, across plains, wetlands. And it is interesting to note that the slums listed in the list are only located in the plains. So on interviewing one official, she remarked that informal settlements in the hills do not typically fit the criteria of slum because they are scattered. Now, I observed that slum categories in Guwahati city are secret and arbitrary and tend to deviate from the ideals of systematic and consistent policy knowledge. And these slum surveys have never been officially published. So they exist in policy document, but they have never been published in official gazette. So it's very easy for the policymakers to deny that they don't exist. And you can see the RTI that I had filed earlier last month, and this is the reply that there is no data. And this is also evident as we move on to the unequal scalar politics, which is characterized by increasing interference of the sovereign state authority within municipal geography, evident through poor implementation of the 74th Amendment and also increasing role of the parastatal like the Guwahati Metropolitan Development Authorities. Now, due to this covert and precarious nature of slum categories in Guwahati, continuous uncertainty prevents people or communities living in informal settlements from claiming their rights. While in the field, I noted specific realities in the sense that interviews reveal that residents are not aware about the notification status of their settlements. Irrespective of the slum category, the state also provides selective and legal entitlements in the name of the holding certificate to the resident to ensure their loyalties. Now, they are liable to pay taxes, but they are never protected from evictions. I also note that unlike the case of Mumbai or Bangalore, where studies show that general deprivation of non-notified slums is higher than notified slum, in case of Guwahati, official categories are just listed on policy and planning documents. They don't reflect the reality. In my analysis, I also found no relation between formal access to basic services and the notification status of the slums as per the lists. Like if it's a notified slum, still they don't have formal access. They don't know they are notified. And there is also no observable correlation between high perceived tenure security and the official slum categories. So during eviction, neither notification status nor perceived tenure security can safeguard a slum. And this category fetishism is also an act of illusion and is driven by political motivation. So during election season, politically motivated commitments like land rights are often founded on the consideration tied to the historically rooted politics of Thalua Khilonjia, which is indigenous Assamese identity. However, when it comes to forced eviction, no one is spared. Now, in conclusion, I actually, through this working paper, I tried to put forward the state's fragmented knowledge of slums and slum categories and how they're unstable, uncertain, and arbitrary and tend to be distinct from the reality. These abstract listing exercise and categories impact everyday lives of people inhabiting informal settlements, and they are not able to claim their rights because none of these are reflected on ground. At a more broader level, the idea is to also look at the lens of, informal settlements from the lens of policy categories, and also the need to identify the urgency to reimagine the informal settlements and housing policies and and policy categories in the city. Thank you. Sorry if I have crossed the time.
No worries. Thank you so much for your presentation, Vrishti. Okay. We have about 20-25 minutes in our panel, and there are some questions that have come in online, and thank you to the online audience also for listening in and being active. Let's gather some questions from the floor, but I'm going to take my role as a moderator and take my privileged position to ask you all some questions also. I think what's come out through all the presentations in different ways is the deep sense of marginality that are coming out of the sites, the people that you are working with and trying to represent. And then there's like this underlying current of where the marginality is coming from and who's enforcing it on that population. And there's something, I think, always to be said about the state and sources of power to marginalize and to shape agency, right? I think we talk about these things all in kind of one breath, and it's useful to try and pass that out, because I think it came up in the panel last evening also, that to be on the margin means that there's also a core, there's a center, there's something there in the middle that's really causing us to think about these people as marginal in some way. So if I could just take a minute and ask each of you a question. Anurag, you really interestingly talked about how the policy to enforce GPS trackers or have them on autos was a failure. And it's really exciting to study failures, because I think we don't do it as much, especially in the context of platform studies. There's such we as scholars also, I think, give platforms far more power than they actually operate with often. And in trying to conceptualize a new form of technological power, we just keep assuming that these actors really know what they're doing, right? So maybe in your context, because your actors are the state and a set of workers, what about what was the state actually trying to do? So you gave us this sense that there was the middle class urgency to try and control the migrant worker, or the working class worker rather. But can you take us a little bit further to think of when there's a failure of surveillance and that body of the worker is not actually being controlled, what does it say about their marginality from this logic? Where is the failure? What what resilience has actually come out of this failure also? To Shubhanshi and Priyanjali, I really appreciated your presentation, and your abstract also was extremely detailed, and I think you have such a great set of data to be working from. 3,000 domestic workers on platforms it's a really great opportunity to actually theorize and conceptualize, what's happening. And I found that there was a little bit of a disjunct in the literature you gave us in the beginning with what you were actually saying was coming out from the field. And if I could ask you to think a little bit about the relationship between work in the traditional domestic work sector, where there's a worker and a client, and there's an understanding that that's a fairly long-term relationship built through very intimate connections and feudalistic and good and bad, and the relationship between the worker and the platform, and what that third party does with the client, right? I haven't gotten a sense. So I think when reconceptualizing traditional employment, there's a idea that the worker and the platform also have a very short-term relationship here. Is that so from your data? And are you able, from your large data set, to actually see the nuances of how different types of platforms work? Right? Because there are digital placement agencies, there are marketplaces, and then there are on-demand platforms. And each of those corporate entities think very differently about the longevity and the retention of those workers. And I've come to see in studying platform businesses also that the retention of the worker varies between different models, and the impetus to try and hold on to those skilled or unskilled people is quite different. So if you can actually help us think about what is happening just on the platform outside the literature you've read and how it's kind of shaped your thinking. Where is the marginality? What kind of platform causes what kind of marginality? Priyanjali, your ethnographic vignettes were really lovely and difficult also to read and see. I think what struck me the most is you talked about how what the agency of being a breadwinner is. That kind of self-perception, right? And I've always, and the kind of dynamics you're talking about, I think many of us who work on women's work have seen these dynamics. So they are female-headed households. And they don't get captured as female-headed households anywhere, right? But there is also something about the agency of doing what society tells you to do, being a mother, providing for your children, giving them the education, that somewhere is quite exceptional. And it came out to me when we were doing a comparative study between South African mothers and Indian mothers, where the structure of the household is quite broken in South Africa for many reasons. Husbands don't exist, fathers don't exist. And there, that sense of agency as being a married woman who's doing the right thing for society was really had broken women when they talked about other parts of their economic lives. So if you could just help us think about the different identities of those women also and what marginality means to their self-perception, I think that could be a really nice takeaway for all of us. Shekhar, I really appreciated your presentation, and I think you've picked up on something that's really contemporary and exciting to look at, because I think this idea of jugaad has started to play up a lot, especially in the new age of design thinking and how people are trying to build for India, right? When I think about the technology economy, a lot of people are trying to understand how people in our country actually behave and how they build and what they want. And you also had the example of, one of the Kamath brothers who was on saying jugaad brings us all together. So actually, can you help us think about what do you think the relationship of jugaad as being incorporated into contemporary capitalism should really tell us, right? There is a marginality to it, absolutely, and you've proved it through your presentation. But there's also the examples of a Jugadu Kamlesh coming on Shark Tank and kind of taking the hearts and melting the hearts of these kind of investors. What do you think that kind of relationship also sheds light on when we think about how the state sees these innovations, or how people or how regulations start to kind of take over these innovations? And Brishti, for you also, I was thinking about there's a deep sense of marginality of the state also in some of what you're saying, right? When you said the term came in a post-colonial context, and only when national urban missions had to be implemented, there's this idea of the slum come. So can you help us actually think about what marginality means to states in a federal structure also? And I think maybe we can take a minute to answer these questions as we just pass the mics around our audience and get questions from the floor. Anurag, I'm looking at you, so.
So the first question was, what was the state actually trying to do? To be very brief about it, I think we have to situate the GPS tracking device issue into two sort of categories. One is the whole refashioning of Delhi into this world-class city before the Commonwealth Games. This was one prompt that allowed this GPS meter issue to be what it is. And the second one was this large-scale transport reforms, of which giving permits to auto rickshaw drivers was one, which, if you're aware of the transport permit issue, it was initially targeting the failure of authorities to clamp down on auto rickshaws, the polluting auto rickshaws. But then it seemed to be a moving goalpost, like the state kept sort of revising its approach and its opinion on what actually it was trying to do. So my reading of the issue is that these two sort of categories need to be explored in consonance to kind of understand where this GPS device issue lies right now. With regard to marginality and resilience, I think one thing that came up in my fieldwork, where I interviewed Uber and Ola taxi drivers in Delhi, was the whole sort of, questioning the category of the data donor and data receiver. And I think that I approach as a form of resilience to this whole GPS tracking issue, or the larger issue of tracking working class lives. So to be very brief about this data donor, data receiver issue, often taxi drivers kind of suggested that if they're giving up data for the benefit of, let's say, middle class passengers should be open to giving up their, Aadhaar card data or PAN card data to them for their benefit, so that they could track if somebody were to not pay them, or if somebody were to harass them or something like that. So I would say that this sort of anointment of data as capital in multiple forms of life and in multiple scales is something that I would think of as resilience, although, what form that resilience ultimately takes is something that we would need to deliberate on.
Hi. So, first of all, beginning with the literature part, when we came up with this extended part of the project, we were looking mostly into how Kiran Moge, an activist and a feminist researcher who's based in Pune, how she back in 2000 and the 1980s, like she organized the domestic workers of Pune, and that's how the Pune Zilla Kamghar Sangathan was formed. And that's how that organization was done. So that literature helped us a lot to delve into this research project and to think more about how it can be transformed into looking at with the influence of gig economy coming in India. So, with reference to that, when we talk about the relationship between, as you mentioned, relationship between domestic worker and the client, and domestic worker and the agency. So, the one of the interviews which we did in Pune was with one of the digital platform agencies that recruits domestic workers. And it was while we were doing the transcription of the interview also, and the field notes and our observation notes. So we came across the fact of how it was very much inclined towards the fact that it looked more of an agency's profit-making kind of thing, because the founder had come up with the idea during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were like, if Swiggy and Zomato is readily available so much, then why not the accessibility of domestic workers? Why would I have to rely on my neighbor to contact for that? And that idea or that chain of thought is very interesting to look at, because this shows that what kind of, as in they also mentioned of how they sort of talk around 30 minutes to 1 hour with the client, and they define everything. But when we talked about, when we prepared the questionnaire and we talked about, what kinds of rights are given to the benefits worker, is there a sexual harassment cell or a gender sensitization cell? So they were like, and they were very nonchalant about it during the interview. And there were mostly like brief gaps, and we had to skip to other questions because there was a kind of a disinterest showed towards that. So we sort of observed, and that's our observation through that particular interview, that the digital platform, and of course due to the lack of awareness and lack of access to technology also, the domestic workers are unable to contact the agencies directly. So the mediation of other people who work for the agency, that comes into hand, and that is how the agency works as a whole. So that was what we could see, that regarding the rights and benefits of domestic workers and the relations, they were kept very subservient and very subordinate as compared to the clients and agencies' mission and values.
Also, I just wanted to add one thing. Yeah. So as it is at the very initial stages, so we will be contacting other platforms and domestic workers to understand what they have been experiencing through gig economy, and how do they define whatever the experience is there. So, like as you asked, what kind of models create what kind of marginalities? So it's very early to speak about it. So we will keep that in mind. Also, like these are three. So what are the few observations that we found out? It's like the professionalization or the formalization is just limited to the clients and the platform. So, like for example, the feedback. It is a one-way feedback system. So the workers cannot give you the feedback. And in contrast with the on-demand thing, like Uber, Ola, the drivers also give you, stars or whatever the experience rate. So it's still on the initial levels, but we will keep that in mind. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So, what does marginality mean for self-perception and for the multiple identities that a lot of these women workers are constantly, simultaneously inhabiting, right? I think there's an acute awareness that there is an amalgamation of different forms of marginality that they're facing on an everyday basis. And then different identities are often at odds with one another. And often there are these contradictions and paradoxes that emerge when she's thinking of herself as a worker in the informal economy, a Muslim woman who's trying to bring up children, a mother who's trying to educate her children, a wife who's trying to make her marriage work in some form. I'm suspicious of accounts that arrange different forms of marginality hierarchically. I think relationally looking at them is far more fruitful. And just to give a small example here to elucidate what I'm saying, right? So the same worker who said, women from UP don't make good domestic workers, right? You should look at us. We persevere more. We don't stay in the house. We go out every day and we earn a living. The same worker is forced to build an alliance and find allies when they have to negotiate with the RWAs, right? So in that situation, she is standing side by side and in all its pessiness, trying to negotiate with a body that is subjugating all of them collectively. So I think it's incredibly complicated, as we've acknowledged over the last few days. But it's really understanding how these contradictions play out. And the same worker that might feel like she's able to resist in one situation finds herself completely voiceless in quite another, right? So, yeah, that's my response.
Shekhar and Rishti, maybe you can just quickly answer. Then we did have some questions from the floor. So,
may I take the questions or Brishti is going forward? Okay, Brishti has signaled that I take the questions. So, hello. I will begin with Aditi's question on the intersection of capitalism and jugaad. I would just mention two examples. One from Chakra from Gujarat, where the entity which innovated Chakra, which were earlier a jugaad vehicle, Atul Auto, is now now a listed company in share market. It's now a 1,500 crore company. And nowadays they don't manufacture Chakra, but that is a regularized vehicle in Gujarat, manufactured within small and medium sales industries. So in that context, you can see that jugaad clearly relates to the capitalism, not from today, it's relating it for a long time. Also, the second example I would take, that in old Delhi, the people who used to aggregate cycle rickshaw, they had like 100 cycle rickshaws. So now the price of a cycle rickshaw is around rupees 5,000, and for a price of a battery jugaad is around 70,000. Now, most of the people who used to aggregate cycle rickshaw has now upgraded to a battery jugaad. So you can see earlier a person who was employing a capital of around 5 lakh rupees now employ a capital of around 70 lakh rupees. So clearly there is a capital accumulation even within jugaad domain. So I think it explains well that how the jugaad and capitalism are not alienated from each other. And coming to the question of Jatin, which came in the window, he asks that to what extent do you think idea of jugaad is romanticized, particularly in context of lack of access to safer and more reliable option? To this, I would mention that we are not romanticizing jugaad. We are only arguing that jugaad are solutions which emerge within the design reality gaps. Somewhere it may be possible that not all the solutions are to be standardized or upgraded. They are impromptu solutions. So we are not into romanticizing jugaad. And but certainly jugaad signifies that there is something which needs to be taken care of. So we go with this mindset. And second question of how do jugaad vehicle features in terms of waste circular economy and government discourse on waste to wealth. I am not very much aware about the government discourse on waste to wealth, but what I understand is they are trying to manage the urban waste from in context of waste to wealth. But in jugaad, it is industrial waste which will be used mostly, like the old scrap vehicle. But I would also say that it's not always that the scrap material are used in making jugaad vehicles. Like if you see the case of e-rickshaw, they were importing the parts from China. They were brand new parts. They were fabricating bodies from brand new sheets. So it's not always the scrap which goes into the jugaad vehicle. Sometimes to minimize the cost, they procure material from the scraps, but they always ascertain the quality. They don't never use the low quality products. So certainly, and in context of circular economy, I would say within Indian context, we were always recycling material, and Indian waste picker is a very strong community. I don't know why we are always pitched this question, because Indian community were always very strong in recycling and reusing the materials. And third question of Aditi.
Shekhar, maybe you can take that question on the Zoom chat and we can ask Vrishti to speak. We just have a few minutes left in the panel. And
I just take 10 seconds. I just want to show one picture.
Sure.
This is, I just wanted to show this picture that even the jugaad vehicles are now regularized. Many people who manufacture jugaad vehicle have now moved on to making the regularized version of it, which is shown in this picture. I'll respond to the Aditi's question in the Zoom only.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Vrishti, and then we'll just open up.
Yeah, thanks. So, I just want to put forward the case of Guwahati, and I would answer it in that context. Now, when we look at, say, states in states in Northeast India, they are diverse, of course, but they share some kind of commonality. Now, when national schemes they come in, they are and they are to be implemented by state government. In Guwahati, what I've observed reading and analyzing the policy documents is that, even if, the situation, the reality of these settlements, they differ. There are specificities. For example, in the hills, the settlement type is different. The patta, the land, nature of land is different, and on the wetland is different, and on the plains it's different. But there is a tendency to kind of follow a particular definition that is kind of identified by the census or the NSSO. And even if they go somewhat adopt a definition which is more apt for the state, when we look at the policy documents, it's particularly the draft slum-free cities plan of action, I see that they don't operationalize these categories: notified, non-notified, identified. They just quote the census data. And it's very surprising that when I tried to cross-verify the data, most of the notified slums in Guwahati were located on railway land, which is very surprising. And no one has answered to this. And I have explored all possible options. And I have also been working in Guwahati prior to my doctoral field work. I've worked there for almost three years exploring this particular domain. And I feel that there is this, I don't know if it is to attract funds or whatever it is. And right now, considering other northeastern states, Assam is getting a lot of fund, particularly in infrastructure investment and things like that. So, right now, this subject is totally parked aside. No one's talking about it. Even the Master Plan 2045, which is in draft stage, has also quoted the data, which is completely contradictory to the reality. So this is just a picture that I wanted to put forward. And if I may answer Jatin's question, Aditi?
Sure. You tell us what the question is also. So.
Yeah, so Jatin asks that the ambiguity around the term slums, perhaps intentional. What do you make sense of the term and how? And how do residents associate themselves with with these slums? Now, if you interact with different stakeholders in Guwahati, I mean, even policymakers, they would say that, in Guwahati, we don't have slums like Delhi, Bombay, things like that. So they consider these, locally called bastis as like, they don't bracket it as slums particularly. So it's difficult to, arrive at, how they are conceptualized by different stakeholders. But when we talk about residents, it varies, like informal, and it has also a lot of relation to the identity aspect, which is deeply tied to the indigenous Assamese identity, deeply tied to the politics of land and the whole NRC issue. That's a different discussion. So that also has to do with how residents are identifying themselves, whether they're, when you say that, do you like, what do you call your settlement? So they have different answer, and it's very specific to different settlements, and it is very deeply tied to identity aspect. And I would stop there. If I missed anything, I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you. So there was the question behind you first. Go
Yeah. Hi. My first question was to Shubhanshi and Pranjali. So it's a different target segment I'm talking about, particularly with respect to street vendors. So one of the aspects one of the parts of my work was also kind of understanding how street vendors can be onboarded on Swiggy and Zomato. And while I understand like there are a lot of issues when it comes to gig economy, like you said, but then in your work around domestic workers, have you also come around certain narratives, particularly with respect to street vendors, when especially during pandemic, when people were not going out and eating, but then this whole gig economy actually had positive externality on street vending. So just on that, if you have some insights on that. And second question is to Brishti. So my first question was like this, I completely understand the notified is an ambiguous term, but typically if I have to give some definition coming from the context of Mumbai, let's say, is that notification is notified, non-notified is often associated with cutoff dates, right? Like 1976 and 2001, 2011, as the government changes. So it's a huge role to play. Politics determines notified and non-notified, right? But then in context of Guwahati, for example, so there is a huge role of perceived tenure security or de facto tenure security also, which defines a lot of security angle of a lot of informal settlements. Like in Mumbai, there are so many settlements which do not have any sort of notification status, but they have de facto and perceived tenure security, and they are still not evicted for past 30, 40, 50 years. Port Trust land being one example, or airport land being another example, and many such examples. So then how do you look at it from Guwahati's perspective? That's it. Thanks.
We'll take a few questions. There was some at the back. Can you ask in the denim jacket? She had her hand up first, and it's behind you. The mic is behind you.
Sorry. Yeah. So my question is to Priyanjali. Your presentation was quite interesting and I enjoyed listening to it. My question is more situated in the cooperative conflict model of Sen regarding gender relations within the household. So he talks about the effect of paid work on the women's perception of her own interest and contributions in the household, as well as her perception of her own well-being at the breakdown point. Your data showed an awareness among your women respondents regarding their household contributions. But what I want to ask did this awareness also translate into them aligning their perceived interests more closely with their actual well-being levels? And second, did it also translate to improving their bargaining power at the crisis points of divorce or violence in marriage, such points? So yeah, these two questions.
Okay. There was a question behind you, and then we can go take two more questions here, and then we'll answer. They had their hands up before. No?
Yeah, my question is to Priyanjali, actually. It's a very interesting work, especially with Muslim women. I was recently listening to a paper which is working on the areas near Jamia where protests happen, and the similar things are sort of happening there, where lives are sort of lived in some kind of secrecy, and but in that work, something very interesting emerged about the changing nature theological dimension of Muslims. At one level, we might see some kind of extremism sort of shaping up, but it's also, there's a new way of inhabiting religion that is also coming up. That it's not simply that these emancipatory gender dimensions are devoid of the religious. There is a genuine political, theological dimension to what is shaping in India at this point of time. Do you have something to say or add to that dimension of that? How are these different sort of things are intersecting with each other, interacting with each other in that?
So,
yeah.
Actually, in the interest of time, maybe we can just take 30 seconds each to respond to your questions, and the extra questions we can take at lunch because we're already over time. So 30 seconds just to conclude and respond.
Yeah, just to be brief, first of all, can I please know your name? Okay, hi. So as you mentioned regarding the street vendors, so of course our study is based strictly around the domestic workers, and of course during our study we have not come across anything like that, but while we were going through the different kinds of literature we were reviewing, so there were even the report by Niti Aayog of 2022, so they have mentioned of how digitization will be taking place, through all of this, how the informal sector will be digitized and formalized in all of these ways. So there are instances in different kinds of literature you can refer to online, where you can see that who is going on board with, be it platform agency or be it becoming an entrepreneur themselves. And just a comment to add that we have while we were trying to contact the agencies, we came across a couple of enterprises regarding domestic workers who were run by very small scale women who didn't have much capital but were running their own sort of an entrepreneurial agency kind of thing, and they were recruiting and just managing that domestic work in Pune. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for both questions. They are very dense, and I would also love to take them offline, but I'm going to try. So the first one, I don't think I quite get what you mean by their own well-being. Like, is it aligned with actual well-being? So I would love to take that offline. But from what I understood, I think I'll respond to the second part first. So bargaining power and what I saw at particular crisis points in their lives, right? And the only thing that I can say from the data is that COVID was a huge crisis moment in all of their lives, right? And it is in that moment, as they were navigating large-scale loss of jobs across the informal economy, as we saw, quite a few of my respondents exhibited and mentioned having a little more decision-making power in the household, particularly because they had more savings than their husband. And they were able to use that in order to bargain and discuss what their plans should be. Not for cases where both husband and wife, for example, had to leave Gurgaon and go back to their districts because they were compelled to. So COVID is my reference point with respect to crisis points. I won't comment on domestic violence, for example, because there have been a few cases, but those cases are very, very complicated to pass a blanket judgment on how much agency women actually had. But I'm happy to discuss it offline. And quickly on the theological dimension, I think my own positionality of being someone who's perceived as Hindu, I'm not identifying, but in a community that is entirely Muslim, meant that it took me a while to start understanding the dimensions of religion, right? And so for the longest time, and this is after sort of prolonged exposure to the field of a little more than a year, I slowly started understanding that the way in which they, and this is from their interviews and participant observation, the way in which the women report inhabiting their identity as Muslims in the village is starkly different from the way in which they do in the city, as one would imagine. However, and this is particularly true in the case of Gurgaon, in the aftermath of the riots that happened last year, they are being able, they're looking to assert their identities a lot more than they used to in the past, right? So whether that's trying to consume beef, whether that is changing their names temporarily, if that means they retain their work, temporarily going back to the village and coming back. So in their little groups, and the urban villages are segregated as well. So in their little groups where they are living, they're trying to assert their identity a lot more. So very crudely put, a lot of them say that we need to be more Muslim to survive and to keep ourselves sane in the current environment. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'll just quickly answer to the question.
Vrishti, can you just take 30 seconds because we're quite over?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, just to answer this question, I would say that in Guwahati, there's no cutoff date or so. I mean, these categories, I mean, they are different for, as I mentioned, that there are different lists and there is no rationale for these criteria. I mean, this is what I have been trying to, basically find out that, what is the criteria for notifying. And as I've just mentioned that, that land on notified slums on railway land have been they have been marked as notified. So which is very unlikely. I mean, it's almost uniformly slums on railway land are never notified. And if you go and check or ask or interview these government officials, then they have no clarity. So this is the confusion and contradiction. And finally, okay, I forgot the second part, but okay. I mean,
thank you for that. I think we'll end with that. Thank you everyone for sitting through this panel, and thank you all the panelists for sharing your research. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you.